All right, y'all, here we go. Last session, and this is going to be awesome. We're honored to have Buie here, but before we start, everybody ready? I have a lot of people to thank. So if you're in a black shirt, you're a leader, stand up, please. These people don't get paid. They go to a lot of training, and they're doing it because they believe in you. That's the sole reason. They believe that you're the future, and they believe in you. And yeah, don't sit down, black shirts. I think that's just really neat, and it makes me privileged to teach at DU, to have students like this that I can call on and say, hey, I need you to give up about 4 nights of your life for training. I need you to give up an entire weekend to help these kids. And so on the way out, just make sure you give your leader a hug or a handshake. Okay, thanks, guys. If you are interested in being a leader for winter quarter, there's an application in your packet where we have a competitive process where we sort of interview people and try to bring them into our leadership team. So if you're interested in being a leader for winter quarter, please fill that out in your packet. It's due October 15th to Professor Holt. Okay, some other people to thank. Lexi, where are you? Stand up. Y'all probably met Lexi. Kyla Harrison, stand up. Behind the scenes, a lot of stuff went right, and it went right because of these people. Okay, Professor Holt, come up here. So, I could never stand up on stage and sing and dance like she does. I couldn't MC the games like she does. I would be nowhere without Professor Holt. I want you all to know that when you have a teacher that cares this much about you, that's a sure privilege, isn't it? So let's give her a huge round of applause. And I'm going to turn the show over to her. This is the last time I'll see you. I just want to really thank you for this. It warms my heart, and it's why we do this, to see your faces here. So thank you.
Thank you to Professor Cicchetti. None of this is possible without him. Right, so I have the distinct pleasure in introducing our next speaker, but before I get there, I just want to say that after he is done speaking, we are going to do the raffle, and we have the same prizes. So if leaders, your students still have tickets that need to get into the bucket, can you slyly, nicely somehow get them down to Lexi so that she can make sure that everyone equally has a fair opportunity to win our amazing prizes? And then followed by the raffle, we'll have our ice cream social. With that being said, I have the honor of letting you know that the next speaker is a very esteemed ethicist. He's from the University of North Carolina. That's where he went to school. He teaches now here at the University of Denver and is probably one of the best professors we have in the Department of Business, Ethics, and Legal Studies. He has a Wikipedia page that you should check out after this is over. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Buie Sewell. Thank you.
So a friend on a rainy Saturday asked me, why are you going back to school today? And I said, well, I got to talk to some special people. And she said, but, you know, you talk to people all the time. It's Saturday. And I said, well, they've been there all day and yesterday too. And I thought about it. And in the kind of time we're in, I have a very good answer to that question. It is so good in a world like this to be in a room full of people who give a damn. Thank you for letting me be here. I teach ethics. That's enough to put you to sleep at the end of a hard weekend, but actually probably to wake you up as well. I think about ethics as the discipline of meaning. If you want your life to mean something, you intend it. If you don't act with intent, it doesn't belong to you. And that's what you've been up to here this weekend. It's what you've been up to as you figure out at this great university who you are, where you're going. Perhaps the ethics boot camp could be best described as an attempt to tune your ears to give you a way to listen differently to what's going on in this world. If ethics is a discipline of meaning, what do we mean for our lives to be about? What is our intent for ourselves? And that, one, that's terrific. There's nothing an old voice needs more than a microphone that works. Even though I was talking about ears that hear. When we think about, in fact, who we intend ourselves to be, it is a question that is never finally answered. It's a question for our whole lives. And so we pursue that, I think, by asking, well, what are we really? What is this I that I intend? What is it really to be a human being? Ethics goes as deep as that. And I want to give you some thoughts of a life long lived where that has constantly been an issue I have faced. There was a writer at the beginning of the 20th century, a very troubled person, a person who spent a lot of time getting a lot of help. Her name was Virginia Woolf. She was a fantastic writer, but she was so torn apart in herself that her life could never be thought of something that she enjoyed. But she gave us some amazing understanding about who we are. Her quest was to find out what was the essence of a human being. What is it that without that we would not be human? She lived in a time when psychology was very mechanistic, when human beings, even in terms of our thoughts and feelings, were thought about as machines. And she rejected that. She rejected that we were just a bunch of synapses and tissue and emotional connections between parts of our brain. She, in fact, believed, and I think this is so important to think about, that what we were really, when you get down to it, that we are all stories. Doesn't that sound strange? She would write in her journal, we are simply the story we tell ourselves to make sense of what happens. The story we tell ourselves. There's a wonderful book just out by Jonathan Gottschall, and it's called The Storytelling Animal. And it has a lot of the new neuroscience in it of our understanding of, how our brain functions. But the beauty of what Gottschall has written is that he reminds us where we came from. We arose in terms of ourself and our culture out of stories long before we could write, long before there was formalized religion. At the very dawn of human consciousness, we sat around the cave and the campfire and we told stories. And we are so much better at understanding ourselves and what means something and what we value through stories still today than in any other possible way to communicate. If you want to know yourself better, listen to the stories you tell people who matter to you. Say the beginning of a nice new relationship. You go out with someone who seems really special. You meet a friend in a new class, and you want to get to know him or her better. And you want them to get to know you. What do you say? What do you tell them? Listen to that, because those things are the best there is of you. And that's good. Oh, you know, you may spin it a little bit. You may slightly overtell it. That's okay. That's who you want to be, and who you want to be in the presence of someone who you want to know. We're the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our experience. But we also need to listen to the stories of others. It was such a compliment just now, in less than 2 minutes, Robert. How quick was that? To hear your story. Corey did it this way. He said, here, I want you to hear this person's story. You've got maybe 2 minutes. But in 2 minutes, I heard things I would never forget about Portland and growing up and the challenges of life. About a life I didn't experience, but that I could relate to. A life that made me more through its story by the hearing. I'm not particularly good with faces or names. You know, you'll have someone who says, I can't really remember names, but I never forget a face. I forget names and faces. What I remember are stories. The sharing of yourself by telling those things that matter to you, and the hearing others is a part of the humanizing process that at its core is ethics. Long before there were rules or norms, there were stories that made us a part of a family, that made us a part of a community, that made us a part of a country. And those stories held people together. And they still do. It is important to know your story. But here's another thing. It's important that your story be cast in some context that is greater than yourself. So important that you find a story that resonates with what is true in you, and you connect yourself to it. We survived having the first of the presidential debates on our campus. I was very proud that they were here, very happy that they are gone. We're still alive and well. I wondered throughout that experience how the two candidates were going to deal with what I see as the truth of the times we're in. These are not easy times. You know that. Everybody knows that. These are times where there are going to be no quick solutions, economically or culturally or environmentally, for the world we're living in. You have been selected to be the generation to deal with the largest issues this planet and this species perhaps has ever faced. I think that's the context in which your story will be worked out. I'm a politician before I became a professor. I'm really glad I switched roles. Politics is a tough business. I am not a very critical person of others who have the nerve to stand for office or serve in high positions. But I am sometimes disappointed. Two things. In the world we're in, there is nothing that is more valuable than the truth. Truth is the most precious element available to us as a people, as a society, as a species. Leaders who will tell it like it is are in short supply. And yet we must have leaders like that. It is popular in politics to suggest that problems can be easily solved. Just vote for me and it will all be better. You are too smart and too committed and too engaged with this world to believe that. I have a story. Actually, I'm accused by the students I teach of having far too many stories. But I have a story. It's a story about a guy named Al. Lived a long time ago. And he lived in England. And he lived in England at a time in ancient Anglican history when there were people from Scandinavia who had come into Scotland and England and Ireland and taken over the place. And of course, to hear the Brits tell it, these people were a real pain in the butt. And everybody wanted them to get the heck out of our land and give us back our country and let us live our lives. And leaders would rise up and promise, if you will just go get your sword and your spear and follow me, we will set England free. And so the good men of England would go and get their swords and spears, and they would go out to fight, and they would lose. The Picts would beat them, and they would come home devastated from the loss. And another leader would rise up and say, look, if we will just be positive about this, if we will just have a better attitude, get your sword and spears, kiss your wives and children goodbye, we will drive these invaders out. And they would lose. And finally, everybody was truly and deeply discouraged that the land would never be free of these people. And there came along my guy named Al. His whole name was Alfred. And Al had a whole different approach. He went around to the villages and towns of England and said, folks, let's get this straight. It is damn near hopeless. This problem we've got with these people from the north, these Norsemen, they are mean and big and armed, and we can't beat them. It's totally hopeless. Someone wrote a poem, G.K. Chesterton, a poet in the first half of the 20th century, wrote a poem called The Ballot of the White Horse. And he encapsulated Alfred's, what would be his stump speech, in a few verses, in a line or two. It went this way. He would come into a town and he would say, I give you naught for your comfort, naught for your desires, save that the storm grows darker still and the seas rise higher. Ugh. But guess what happened? Englishmen turned to each other and said, at least he's telling us the truth. And they got their shields, they got their swords, and they got their spears, and they made England free. We don't have politicians willing to tell it like it is so often today. And that is tragic. The world ahead of you is tough, but you are tougher. The world ahead of you is challenging, but you're up to the challenge. But you don't start out with an encompassing story that says the best days of America are ahead of it. I don't know whether that's true or not. I know the greatest challenge this country has ever faced is ahead of it. And the reason for being here on a Saturday is not just because it's rainy and snowy outside. It's because I want to see the faces of people I trust, young men and young women, to take on that challenge. I remember a moment in my own life, long time ago now. It was 1960. And I had worked in my first presidential campaign. I was given a precinct in Richmond, Virginia, where a lot of Republicans lived. And they gave it to me because I was a Democrat and I probably couldn't do any harm anyway. And I worked that precinct hard. Nobody wanted to see me and talk to me. And I still went door to door to door. I believed in John Kennedy and what he said, and the way he framed the future that I, exactly at your age, maybe a year or two older, was trying to figure out how to step into. And by the narrowest of margins, of course, as you know from your history, Kennedy won. His inauguration in Washington, D.C. was an amazing event in my young life. I felt like I'd been a part of that story and had been a part of that change that took place in 1960. And it was January of 1961. And a very old man was asked to be there to read a poem. And Robert Frost, great poet, in his 80s by that point, on an amazingly bright and cold day, he stood up to read a poem. It was a beautiful poem. It was a poem he had just written. It was a poem celebrating the coming of Camelot and the world being totally different. And the sun was so bright, his hands so shaky, his eyes so dimmed by that bright light that he couldn't see the words to read them. And he had to stop right in the middle of the inauguration and quote from memory a story, a poem that was a part of his very soul. And that poem was so much more important than the poem he would have read. That poem was called The Land Not Taken. And it goes, the land was ours before we were the land's. We did not own that which possessed us. We were unstoried. We are not owned by anything except a sense of narrative connection. And as we have made this land ours and come to know it, we have framed stories that make us citizens of it and a part of it. And we're at the time of needing a new story. I don't know what the details of it will be. It will be, I know, in part about living peacefully with other nations of the world and other peoples of our planet across lines of culture and tension. I know it will be a story about living peacefully with the good earth, with being tenders of this magnificent garden that we have been given. And I know it will be a story about venturing into space and realities that none have ever gone to before. And someone will frame that story. And what the boot camp is about is tuning your ears to listen for it. That which is true in you will be in that story that soon will be for you to relate to and engage with. That story will change who we are and it will make you more than you ever dreamed you could be. I was the pastor of a very small church in Alabama when I was 25 years old. And there was a demonstration in Birmingham, just 37 miles from where I lived. My wife, my first daughter, and I, in a small house, 92 people in our church. Not much of a salary, but a hell of a job. And there was a demonstration in Birmingham, and the police used dogs and fire hoses, and the people in that demonstration had tried to get a permit, as the law required, to march, but because they were African American, they were denied a permit, even though the First Amendment says that government will have no power to prevent us from peaceably assembling to seek redress of our grievances. They put a guy named Martin Luther King, in jail. And on pieces of paper, on toilet paper and pieces of bags that he tore, and a scrap of writing material or two, he penned a letter. From that jail, he wrote to the Protestant clergy of Alabama. It could have had Buie's name right on it. I was a part of the Protestant clergy of Alabama. I thought I was a good guy. I preached great sermons. I said the right things. You know what Dr. King said? He said, "Dear Protestant clergy, you're the problem. Not the bull conners, not the people with the dogs and fire hoses. The conditions we have. It's you." Why am I doing that? It's the microphone, really. And he put his finger exactly where the problem was. It wasn't people acting in ways that were against where history was going that was the problem. There's always resistance. It was good people who knew the right but resisted you tell your Dr. Thompson, I want him to sit on my left hand today when we do this service. And then he and the others turned, Dr. King turned back and said, and Jesse here will make sure that you, when you get to Brown Chapel, get this hooked up. And I got to meet Jesse Jackson at the same time. He and I would do politics together years later. And remember when we first met. So Dr. King and the group went away, and Dr. Thompson and the people from my seminary came in on their airplane, and we're going to our 2 cars, and I said, Dr. Thompson, Dr. King would like for you to sit on the rostrum with him at Brown Chapel today. And I'd never heard Dr. Thompson cuss. He was a saint. He was head of my church. He said, Bowie, how the hell did you do that? I said, I don't know. I just went up and said, the whole thing. We got there. Dr. Thompson was immediately greeted. Took an hour and a half before the service started. I should have told you that I was really nervous because even though I wanted to help my church be at this important occasion in the civil rights movement, I was really nervous about getting arrested. I was because my father and I had fought about this all our lives. I have such good memories of Dad. He was a very conservative man. He was Attorney General of North Carolina, the highest law enforcement officer in the state. But he didn't believe that you should break the law in order to change it. So if you didn't get a permit for a march, you shouldn't have the march. You should try to vote out the people who wouldn't give you the permit. Bowie believed that civil disobedience was sometimes justified. I just didn't want to be there myself. And I really didn't want to get in jail and hear from back in North Carolina that Malcolm Sewell's son was arrested in Selma. I was frightened. But we went into the chapel and everything went as I was hoping it would, and Dr. Thompson looked so good. The first Southern church to be represented in the civil rights movement by its head. And there he was. And I had played some role in it. But I was hoping we could all go home pretty soon. And at the end of a beautiful sermon, Dr. King said, and so today we go forth. As the prophet Jeremiah said, we shall go forth. And people in the church started raising their hands and saying, we shall go forth. And I'm thinking, we're going to jail. And they raised their hand and said, we shall go forth. Dr. King said it 4 or 5 times, and Bowie thinks in his head, yeah, we're going forth all right. This is going to be really bad. I didn't come down here to go to jail. I promised my wife I'd be home for dinner. At the last moment, with the 200 people in the little church just at fever pitch, Dr. King reaches inside his pocket and takes out a piece of paper and holds it up, just a piece of paper. And he says, and today, for the first time in the history of the civil rights movement in Alabama, we go forth under the order of the federal court granted by Judge Johnson in Montgomery this morning. And I say, thank you, Jesus. We are not going to jail today. You know, you make a lot of mistakes in life, and you do things that you wish you hadn't done, and you didn't even come anywhere close to being perfect. But the day my story resonated to that leader's great story of what life was about, I would never be the same. It's a time to listen. You have worked to tune yourself to the values that matter. Don't give that up. And ahead of you is someone who is going to clarify and focus and reshape the world you're in. And I hope you hear that story, because you're amazing people. Thank you.